Hi guys. Tonight we step back into a world governed by the steady, rhythmic pulse of the seasons and the law. Tonight we witness the procedural integrity of a society that balanced the heavy labor of the fields with the delicate scales of justice. From the smoke-filled forge to the hushed stones of the parish church, you will see how a community calibrated itself through disciplined coordination and shared responsibility. As the evening shadows stretch across the village green, we invite you to observe the architecture of a vanished world where every grain was measured, every boundary was guarded, and the mechanical art of the manor beat with a timeless harmony. To understand the medieval courtroom, one must first enter the physical space of the manorial hall. Unlike a modern, sterilized courtroom, the medieval seat of justice was a multifunctional environment, often serving as the same room where the lord of the manor conducted his daily business or held communal feasts. The air in these halls was thick with the scent of old rushes, beeswax, and the persistent aroma of drying parchment. As the sun filters through the high, narrow windows, it illuminates the structural symmetry of the room. At the far end stands the dais, a raised wooden platform where the judge or steward sits. This elevation was not merely for status, but a way to aid vocal projection, ensuring that the rulings of the law could be heard clearly by the commoners gathered in the well of the hall. The furniture of the court was built for durability. The heavy oak tables were held together not by nails, but by precise wooden dowels and tenon joints. As you imagine yourself sitting in this hall, observe the sturdy nature of the wood as it holds the weight of the massive legal ledgers. The judges' chairs were carved with high backs, providing a clear boundary between the authority of the court and the bustling activity of the outside world. There were no short-tempered outbursts here. The courtroom was a space designed for the gradual uncovering of facts. The rhythmic sound of a heavy book being placed on the table served as the heartbeat of the proceedings, a signal that the essential work of documenting human behavior was about to begin. The character of the judge, or the steward, was defined by dignified detachment. He was often a man of significant education, a person who understood the logic of the statute. He did not arrive with the intent of being cruel, but with the intent of being consistent. His role was to maintain the peace of the realm. He wore heavy wool robes, often in deep, muted colors that reflected his disciplined lifestyle. He was a man who lived a life of profound procedural integrity, single-mindedly focused on the standardized application of the law. He was not there to be a hero, but to be a processor of information, turning the accusations of neighbors into the formal entries of the court roll. In his personal life, he was frequently a man of solitary habits, often remaining single to avoid local conflicts of interest, ensuring his wealth and focus remained tied to his legal duties. One must consider the creation of the court roll. Before the trial could begin, the room was filled with the steady scratching of the clerk's quill. The clerk acted as the official memory of the court. He used a specific type of iron gall ink, which etched the words into the vellum with a permanent chemical bond. This was a study in information longevity. Every detail, the theft of a tool, the boundary dispute over a fence, the failure to pay a tithe, was recorded in a tight, consistent script. The clerk did not look up. He was focused entirely on accurate transcription. The atmosphere of the room was anchored by the relentless movement of his hand across the page, ensuring that the law remained a recorded document that could be referenced for generations. The transition from the record to the evidence involves the solemnity of the oath. In the medieval world, the oath was a grave commitment. When a witness stood before the court, they were not just speaking, they were engaging in a binding agreement with the divine. The tension in the room intensified as the witness placed their hand on a Bible or a relic. This was an exercise in moral accountability. The court believed that a false oath would result in the spiritual ruin of the witness. This absolute belief provided the necessary pressure to keep the testimony honest. There was no need for short-tempered cross-examination. The weight of the oath was often enough to produce the truth. One must also look at the function of the jury. In the early medieval period, the jury was not a group of strangers, but a gathering of neighbors. They were chosen for their intimate knowledge of the defendant's character. This was a form of communal oversight. The deliberation of the jury was a process of weighing the social stability of the village. They were not looking for complex legal loopholes. They were looking to restore the rightful balance of the community. If a man was known to be short-tempered or dishonest in his daily dealings, the jury used that data to reach a verdict. They were the observers of the community, detecting the underlying conflicts that threatened the peace of the manor. The quirky yet profound element of the hall was the timing of the proceedings. In some larger courts, a small clepsydra water clock was used to regulate the duration of the speeches. This was a method of liquid timekeeping. As the water dripped from one vessel to another, it provided a measured limit to the proceedings. The steady drip, drip, drip was a constant sound in the hall, a reminder that time, like the law, is a steady progression. It prevented short-tempered orators from rambling, forcing them to align their arguments with the flow of the water. This ensured that the court remained a place of fairness, where every case received its allotted share of the day. You find yourself standing at the back of this cold, echoing hall. The air is still and carries the scent of old wood, and the faint, sweet smell of the floor rushes. You see the judge sitting on the dais, his face a mask of contemplation. You hear the rhythmic scratching of the clerk's quill and the distant, muffled sound of the heavy door closing. The atmosphere of the afternoon is heavy and peaceful. You feel a sense of profound security, realizing that you are in a place where the established rules of the world are being applied with absolute steadiness. You realize that justice is not a flash of lightning, but the slow turning of a wheel, shifting the chaos of life into the stability of order. So, as we settle into the imaginary scent of the parchment and the steady rhythm of the quill, remember that the story of the medieval court is a study in the architecture of peace. It was a place where a word was a contract and a hall was a foundation. They proved that the human spirit can find stability by adhering to the laws of the community, turning the practical steps of a trial into a masterpiece of social harmony that would carry the world through the night. While the judge held the authority of the dais, the court clerk was the true engine of the legal system. His life was defined by the disciplined preparation of the court's memory, a task that began long before the first petitioner entered the hall. To the casual observer, the clerk's role might seem like a series of administrative movements, but in reality, he was the architect of a community's history. He sat in the quiet of his scriptorium, a dedicated workspace, often tucked away in a corner of the manor house or a nearby rectory, preparing the materials that would capture the day's disputes. This was a task of intense physical labor. He would begin with a sheet of vellum, usually made from calfskin, which had been stretched, scraped, and smoothed with pumice stone. He then treated the surface with chalk to ensure it would properly accept the ink. This was a necessary step in material preservation, ensuring that the record would not rot or fade over the coming centuries. The clerk was a man of profound focus, often a member of the lower clergy or a professional scribe who had spent years mastering the art of the written word. In his personal life, he was a figure of solitary habits, because his work required absolute literacy and a mastery of legal Latin. He was a rarity in the medieval village. He lived a life of profound procedural integrity, often remaining single as his duties frequently required him to travel between various manors within a lord's estate. His wealth was not measured in land, but in his specialized tools, his precious quills harvested from the primary flight feathers of geese, his inkhorns, and his ability to transform the chaotic spoken word into a permanent, standardized record. He was not prone to the short-tempered nature of the litigants he recorded. Instead, he maintained an aesthetic of calm, his hand steady, and his mind sharp as he prepared for the day's work. One must consider the logistics of the iron gall ink. The clerk did not simply buy his ink, he often brewed it himself. This was a study in chemical stability. He combined oak gall's small, tannin-rich growths found on oak trees with iron salts and a binder like gum arabic. The result was a liquid that was initially pale but darkened as it oxidized on the vellum. This was an exercise in document security. Because the ink bit into the animal's skin, it was nearly impossible to erase without leaving a visible scar on the surface. This prevented dishonest individuals from altering the vital details of land grants or fines. The clerk's workspace was defined by the smell of these tannins and the steady, rhythmic sound of the quill being dipped into the horn, a process that regulated the pace of his thoughts and the consistency of his script. The transition from preparation to recording involves the geometry of the page. Before writing a single word, the clerk would prick and rule the vellum. Using a small awl and a straight edge, he would create a series of tiny holes along the margins, and then draw light lines with a lead point or a dry stylus. This provided a standardized framework for the text, ensuring that the entries remained straight and legible. This was a form of visual organization that allowed the judge to quickly scan the roll for specific names or dates. The clerk viewed the empty page as a space that required disciplined management. He did not waste space, for vellum was expensive. Yet he ensured that the margins were wide enough for later annotations. This attention to detail was what allowed the court to function as a reliable archive over many decades. One must also look at the function of the legal shorthand to keep up with the flow of the trials. The clerk developed a system of textual abbreviations. In the medieval legal world, certain phrases such as the said party or in the peace of the Lord appeared so frequently that the clerk used standardized symbols to represent them. This was a method of clerical efficiency. It allowed him to maintain a steady pace without falling behind the testimony. However, when the time came to write the final court roll, he would expand these notes into a formal, professional Latin prose known as courthand. This script was dense and angular, designed not for beauty, but for unambiguous clarity. The clerk's character was reflected in this script. It was ordered, traditional, and entirely devoid of the short-tempered flourishes that might characterize a less disciplined hand. The quirky, yet profound element of the clerk's kit was the penknife. This tool was as important as the quill itself. The clerk used it to constantly sharpen the tip of the feather, ensuring that the lines remained thin and sharp. But the knife also served as an eraser of sorts. If a mistake was made, the clerk would use the blade to carefully scrape the top layer of the vellum away, removing the ink before it had fully set. This was an act of surgical precision. The sound of the blade against the skin was a reminder that even in a world of permanent records, there was a mechanism for correction. It showed that the clerk was the guardian of accuracy, a man whose entire existence was dedicated to the rectification of error and the maintenance of a truthful history. As the morning light grows stronger, you see the clerk begin to move his materials from the scriptorium to the main hall. He carries his scrolls with a sense of reverence, understanding that he is the custodian of the village's secrets. He sets up his portable desk on a trestle table below the judge's dais. The air around him is still, carrying the scent of ink and the smell of old leather. You see him test the sharpness of his quill, the movement rhythmic and practiced. You hear the soft clink of the inkhorn being settled into its hole. The atmosphere of the hall is one of anticipation and order. You feel a sense of profound trust in this man, realizing that while he rarely speaks, his hand is the one that gives the law its physical form. So, as we settle into the imaginary texture of the vellum and the steady dark of the ink, remember that the story of the medieval clerk is a study in the persistence of memory. It was a place where a feather was a tool of state and a skin was a ledger. He proved that the human spirit can preserve the order of society by adhering to the practical steps of documentation, turning the labor of a single man into a foundation of justice that would outlast the very stone walls of the manor house, carrying the truth of each life into the long reach of history. The transition from the quiet preparation of the clerk to the active gathering of the community began with the summons. In the medieval legal system, a trial could not proceed in a vacuum. It required the physical presence of the accused, the accuser, and a web of witnesses. This was managed through a system of procedural notification. Long before the court date, a subordinate official known as the beadle or the bailiff would travel the muddy lanes of the manor to deliver the necessary verbal notice to appear. This was a study in geographic management, as the bailiff had to account for every household within the jurisdiction. The goal was to ensure that no one could claim ignorance of the proceedings, maintaining a standardized flow of information that kept the machinery of justice moving forward. The character of the bailiff was one of strict practicality. He was often a man of local standing, chosen for his reliability and his knowledge of the village's social landscape. In his personal life, he was a figure of constant motion, his work taking him to every corner of the lord's estate. While he was often seen as a grim figure by those he summoned, his character was defined by a quiet sense of duty rather than aggression. He was a man who understood the logistics of accountability. He was frequently a family man with his own small plot of land, giving him a vested interest in the social stability he helped enforce. His wealth was modest, consisting of a small salary and the authority bestowed upon him by his mace or staff of office, which served as a visual anchor of the law's reach. One must consider the system of frank pledge. This was the essential foundation of medieval law enforcement. Instead of a professional police force, the community was organized into tithings, groups of 10 or 12 men who were collectively responsible for each other's behavior. This was a study in mutual surveillance. If one member of the tithing was summoned to court and failed to appear, the entire group was fined. This created a steady pressure for the community to self-regulate. There was no need for pursuit of fugitives. The reality of financial loss ensured that neighbors would physically bring the accused to the hall. It was a method of distributed responsibility, turning the entire village into a watchdog for the king's peace. The core of the summoning process involved the requirement of pledges. When a person was accused of a minor misdemeanor, such as blocking a common path or letting their pigs wander into a neighbor's grain, they had to provide pledges of prosecution. These were two or more individuals who acted as a human form of bail. This was a study in social collateral. If the defendant fled, these pledges would have to pay the fine in their stead. The court viewed these pledges as reliable guarantees of the law's integrity. This system reinforced the character of the community as one based on procedural trust. You didn't just stand before the judge alone. You stood there, backed by the solid commitment of your peers, ensuring that every trial was anchored in local accountability. The transition from the village to the courtroom door involved the logistics of the Isoin. In a world defined by the reality of slow travel, illness, and agricultural demands, the law provided a mechanism for a legitimate delay. An Isoin was a formal excuse for non-attendance. The clerk would record these in a specific column of the court roll, noting whether the person was beyond the sea on the king's service or simply languishing in bed. This was an exercise in administrative flexibility. However, the court was not easily fooled. A person could usually only claim an Isoin 3 times before the patience of the law ran out. This regulated the temporal rhythm of the court, balancing the needs of the individual with the procedural consistency of the manor. One must also look at the function of the attachment. If a defendant failed to appear and had no legitimate excuse, the court moved to a more physical form of incentive. The bailiff would be ordered to distrain the individual, which meant seizing a piece of their property, perhaps a brass pot, a cow, or a plowshare, to be held by the court until the person appeared. This was a study in economic leverage. The sight of one's livelihood being led away to the Lord's pound was a powerful motivator. It transformed the legal summons from an abstract concept into a tangible loss. The bailiff managed this process with methodical care, documenting the condition of the seized goods to prevent any disputes over damage during the period of impoundment. The quirky, yet profound, element of the summons was the hue and cry. For more serious or sudden crimes, the community utilized a vocal alarm system. If a crime was discovered, the victim was legally required to raise the hue and cry, shouting for help. Every able-bodied man who heard it was then legally bound to drop their tools and join the chase. This was an act of immediate social mobilization. If the village failed to raise the cry or catch the offender, the entire community was fined. This turned the task of law enforcement into a dynamic event, proving that the justice system relied on the lungs and legs of every citizen. It was the acoustic notification of a breach in the peace, ensuring that the law was never a distant force. You find yourself standing at the edge of the village green as the sun begins to rise. The air is cool and smells of wood smoke and the scent of damp wool. You see the bailiff moving steadily toward the manor hall, his wooden staff striking the ground with a rhythmic thud. Behind him follows a small group of men, the pledges, walking with a determined pace. You hear the distant, muffled sound of a sheep bleating from the Lord's pound and the rhythmic clop-clop of a horse on the stone road. The atmosphere of the morning is one of heavy anticipation. You feel a sense of profound order, realizing that the logistics of the summons have successfully pulled the village together. You realize that justice is a coordinated movement, a series of essential steps that ensure no one is left outside the reach of the law. So, as we settle into the imaginary scent of the morning mist and the steady walk of the pledges, remember that the story of the medieval summons is a study in the persistence of community. It was a place where a neighbor was a bond and a staff was a command. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of accountability, turning the movements of a bailiff into a masterpiece of social cohesion that would hold the community together through the trials of the day. The transition from the outdoor gathering to the indoor proceedings began with the formal opening, a moment that transformed the manorial hall from a domestic space into a seat of power. This was not a sudden event, but a series of measured proclamations designed to establish an atmosphere of absolute authority. As the morning light solidified, the crier or the bailiff stood at the entrance of the hall and issued the vital call to order. This was known as the oyez, derived from the Old French word for hear thee. This was an exercise in auditory boundaries, a signal to the gathered crowd that the time for private conversation had ended and the time for public record had begun. The rhythmic repetition of the call served as a vocal anchor, grounding the proceedings in a traditional structure that had remained unchanged for generations. The character of the court crier was one of reliable consistency. He was chosen for the clarity and volume of his voice, a man whose presence was defined by steadiness and tradition. In his personal life, he was often a figure of simple, disciplined habits, perhaps a local craftsman or a tenant who took pride in his essential role. He remained a man of profound integrity, as his voice was the primary tool of the law's communication with the illiterate majority. His wealth was not found in land or gold, but in the respect of his peers and the small, regular payments he received for each court session. He was not a man of outbursts. Rather, his character was one of deliberate patience, standing at his post until the last echoes of his proclamation had settled into the wood of the hall. One must consider the logistics of the seating. This was a study in spatial hierarchy. The judge or steward ascended the dais with a deliberate, slow pace, his heavy wool robes rustling against the wooden floor. Behind him, the clerk took his place at the trestle table, arranging his inkhorns and quills with methodical care. Below them, the well of the hall was partitioned to separate the litigants from the observers. This was a method of crowd management, ensuring that the administrative work could proceed without the physical friction of a chaotic crowd. The seating arrangement was a visual map of the law, where every individual knew their specific place within the structure of the day. The core of the opening ceremony involved the installation of the jury in the manor court. This group was often referred to as the jury of presentment. These 12 men were called forward by name, a process of individual identification that reinforced their personal accountability. As they stepped forward, they stood in a line before the dais, their weathered faces reflecting a sense of duty. This was a study in communal representation. They were not strangers to the law. They were the essential eyes and ears of the manor. Their installation was a procedural transition, shifting the responsibility for the facts from the officials to the residents themselves. This ensured that the court remained a local institution, rooted in the daily realities of the people it served. One must also look at the function of the judicial charge. Once the jury was seated, the steward would deliver a comprehensive speech outlining the crimes and issues they were to investigate. This was a study in legal orientation. He would list the articles of the view, which included everything from the maintenance of bridges and the cleaning of ditches to the reporting of strangers and the weight of bread. This was an act of intellectual calibration, ensuring that the jury understood the specific parameters of their task. The steward's voice was calm and measured, avoiding any oratory in favor of a standardized delivery that emphasized the permanence and predictability of the law. The transition from the charge to the active session involved the checking of the assignment. The clerk would read aloud the names of those who had sent formal excuses for their absence. This was a process of administrative verification. The jury had to confirm that the excuses, such as a broken leg or a washed-out road, were truthful. This was a form of local vetting. If a neighbor knew the excuse was a lie, the patience of the court would evaporate, and the person would be fined for default. This regulated the integrity of the attendance, ensuring that the necessary work of the court was not delayed by dishonesty. It was a rhythmic, predictable part of the morning, a procedural heartbeat that signaled the start of the heavy work. The quirky, yet profound, element of the opening was the silent prayer, or the sign of the cross. In many halls, before the first case was called, there was a moment of spiritual alignment. The entire room would pause in a deep silence. This was an act of moral centering. It reminded everyone present that the laws of the manor were ultimately reflections of a higher, absolute divine order. This was a study in behavioral regulation, using a shared belief system to cool any passions before the trials began. It transformed the hall from a site of property disputes into a sacred space of justice, where every word spoken was seen as an entry in a much larger, eternal ledger. You find yourself standing near the heavy stone hearth as the crier's voice fades into the rafters. The air is cool and smells of wood smoke and the scent of damp wool. You see the steward settle into his high-backed chair, the wood creaking with a steady, rhythmic sound. You hear the soft rustle of the clerk's vellum and the distant, muffled thump of the jury members taking their seats on the benches. The atmosphere of the hall is one of focused anticipation. You feel a sense of profound stability, realizing that the rituals of the opening have successfully created a protected environment for the truth. You realize that justice begins with the establishment of order, a series of essential movements that turn a common room into a fortress of the law. So, as we settle into the imaginary scent of the old wood and the steady rhythm of the proclamations, remember that the story of the medieval opening is a study in the persistence of tradition. It was a place where a voice was a gate and a seat was a duty. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of ceremony, turning the start of a day into a masterpiece of social structure that would guide the community through the difficult questions of the trials to come. The transition from the opening rituals to the substance of the day began with the presentment of nuisances. This was an essential part of the Manorial Court's function, focusing on the physical upkeep of the village and its resources. Unlike the high drama of criminal theft, these cases dealt with the logistics of the landscape. The jury was required to report any nuisances that interfered with the common good. This included everything from a blocked drainage ditch to a hedge that had grown too far over a public path. This was an exercise in environmental stewardship, ensuring that the vital infrastructure of the manor remained functional for all. The proceedings were marked by a steady, rhythmic delivery of facts, as the jury moved through a list of local grievances that affected the daily flow of life. The character of the juror presenting these issues was one of practical observation. He was usually a man who spent his days in the fields, someone with an intimate understanding of the physical boundaries of the parish. In his personal life, he was a figure of constant vigilance, noticing when a neighbor's pigs had escaped into the wheat or when a bridge had become dangerous. His character was defined by a quiet commitment to the collective, rather than a desire for conflict. He was a man of profound local integrity, often staying single or living a very disciplined family life to ensure he remained an unbiased observer of his neighbors' habits. His wealth was his knowledge of the land, and his role in the court was to serve as a human censor for the critical repairs needed to keep the community stable. One must consider the logistics of the watercourse. In a medieval village, water was the lifeblood of both agriculture and industry, and its necessary flow was protected by law. A major portion of the afternoon was often taken up by reports of diverted streams or unscoured gutters. This was a study in hydraulic accountability. If a tenant failed to clean the section of the ditch that ran past his property, the water would back up and flood his neighbor's field. The court viewed this not as a simple mistake, but as a breach of the social contract. The offender was issued a firm order to rectify the situation by a specific date. This system of preventative maintenance ensured that the village did not succumb to the destructive forces of erosion and flooding. The core of these trials involved the regulation of straying animals. The reality of medieval life was that fences were often flimsy and animals were frequently hungry. The court rolls are filled with entries regarding trespass by kine or pigs in the Lord's wood. This was a study in pastoral discipline. When an animal was found where it should not be, it was taken to the pound, a sturdy stone or wooden enclosure. This was a method of property impoundment, holding the animal as effective collateral until the owner paid for the damage and a small fine to the court. This prevented brawls between neighbors, providing a standardized resolution for the constant friction caused by livestock. One must also look at the function of the encroachment. This occurred when a tenant tried to add an illegal few inches to their own field by moving a boundary stone or plowing into the common path. This was an act of geographic theft. The jury used their collective memory of the landmarks to identify these shifts. This was a process of boundary verification. The court would order the tenant to return the land to its former state and pay a fine. This preserved the spatial integrity of the manor, ensuring that the vital common lands were not slowly eaten away by individual greed. It was a rhythmic, predictable part of the law, focused on the preservation of the status quo. The transition from property to infrastructure involved the maintenance of the king's highway. Every tenant was legally responsible for the upkeep of the roads and bridges adjacent to their holdings. If a bridge fell into disrepair, it hampered the logistics of trade and communication. The court viewed a broken bridge as a structural failure of the community. The jury would present the names of those responsible for the heavy labor of hauling stone and timber for repairs. This was a form of compulsory public service. The steward's role was to ensure that the work was scheduled and completed, turning the necessity of roadwork into a coordinated effort that kept the village connected to the wider world. The quirky, yet profound element of nuisance law was the Assize of Bread and Ale. To ensure the community was not cheated, the court regulated the quality and weight of these staples. Ale tasters were appointed to visit local brewers and ensure the ale was wholesome for the human body and sold at the fair price set by the law. This was a study in consumer protection. If a baker sold bread that was too light, they were presented in court and fined. This was a form of market calibration, ensuring that the most essential aspects of daily survival were not compromised by dishonesty. It transformed the court into a guardian of the hearth, proving that justice was as much about the law of the land. You find yourself standing near the open door of the hall as the shadows begin to lengthen. The air is still and carries the scent of damp earth and the smell of a nearby stable. You see the steward listening to a long list of clogged drains and overhanging branches, his face a mask of steady concentration. You hear the rhythmic scratching of the clerk's quill as he records each fine and the distant, muffled sound of a cow lowing from the village pound. The atmosphere of the hall is one of methodical repair. You feel a sense of profound relief, realizing that the work of the court is preventing the village from falling into decay. You realize that justice is the constant grooming of the world, a series of essential tasks that keep the paths clear and the water flowing. So, as we settle into the imaginary scent of the freshly turned earth and the steady rhythm of the presentments, remember that the story of the medieval nuisance is a study in the persistence of the common. It was a place where a ditch was a duty and a loaf was a trust. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of maintenance, turning the details of village life into a masterpiece of social health that would sustain the community through the seasons of the year. The transition from the physical maintenance of the village to the intangible world of commerce began with the settlement of debts. In the medieval manor, cash was often a rarity, and the economy functioned on a complex web of credit and mutual obligation. Most residents lived in a state of continuous financial entanglement, where a bushel of grain borrowed in the winter was promised for labor in the summer. When these agreements broke down, the court acted as a neutral regulator. These trials were not about accusations of theft, but about the precise calibration of value. The court viewed an unpaid debt as a disruption of the community's equilibrium, and its goal was to restore the necessary flow of goods and services that kept the local economy alive. The character of the plaintiff in a debt case was one of meticulous record-keeping. He was often a local merchant or a more prosperous tenant who maintained an accurate memory of his transactions. In his personal life, he was a figure of disciplined calculation, understanding the importance of a tally stick or a notched piece of wood that served as a receipt. His character was defined by a quiet persistence rather than a demand for immediate payment. He was a man of profound economic integrity, often remaining single or living a very frugal life to ensure his capital remained liquid for his essential business dealings. His wealth was his reputation for fairness, and he came to court not to ruin his neighbor, but to ensure the standardized fulfillment of a contract. One must consider the logistics of the tally stick before the widespread use of paper receipts. The effective tally stick was the primary tool of contract law. A piece of hazel or willow was notched to indicate the amount of the debt, then split down the middle. One half, the foil, was kept by the debtor, and the other, the stock, was kept by the creditor. This was a study in physical verification. In court, the two pieces were precisely matched together to prove the validity of the claim. This was a method of anti-fraud technology. If the notches did not align, the court would reject the case. This ingenious system provided a tangible anchor for the truth, ensuring that the details of a loan were not lost to the fog of memory or the lies of a dishonest party. The core of these trials often involved the breach of covenant. This occurred when a promise of labor or a specific service was not fulfilled. For example, a carpenter might have been paid in advance to repair a barn roof but failed to complete the work before the harvest. This was a study in operational reliability. The court viewed time and skill as tradable assets. The jury would investigate the logistics of the failure. Was the wood unavailable, or did the craftsman simply neglect his duty? This was a process of performance auditing. The court would often order the defendant to fulfill the covenant by a specific feast day or pay fair damages to the plaintiff. This reinforced the sanctity of the word, ensuring that the village remained a place where promises were kept. One must also look at the function of the wage dispute. As the medieval world moved toward a more cash-based system, the court became the arbiter for laborers who had not been paid their legal wages. This was an act of labor regulation. The statutes of laborers set specific price ceilings for work, and the court had to ensure that both the employer and the employee were adhering to these mandatory rates. This was a study in market stabilization. If a reaper was promised 4 pence for a day's labor but received only 3 pence, the court would enforce the rightful payment. This prevented the exploitation of the poor, turning the court into a guardian of the fair wage and a vital protector of the working class. The transition from local trade to wider commerce involved the regulation of the market. The Manorial Court was responsible for the strict enforcement of the view of frank pledge regarding sales. This included the verification of weights and measures. Every merchant was legally required to use standardized bowls and scales that had been marked with the Lord's seal. This was a study in metrological accuracy. If a merchant used a fraudulent light bushel to sell grain, they were presented in court and fined. This was a form of commercial hygiene, ensuring that the act of buying food did not become a source of grievance. It transformed the court into a center of trust, proving that the consistency of a pound was the foundation of a peaceful community. The quirky, yet profound element of contract law was the God's penny, to seal a binding deal. The buyer would often give the seller a small coin known as an earnest penny or God's penny. This was not a down payment, but a symbolic finalization of the contract. Once the penny changed hands, the bargain was legally irrevocable. This was a study in ritualized commitment. The court viewed the God's penny as an absolute barrier against paired second thoughts. If a seller tried to back out of a deal after accepting the penny, the court would firmly hold them to the original terms. It turned a simple gesture into a legal lock, proving that the rituals of the marketplace were the mechanical gears that kept the village economy turning. You find yourself standing near the clerk's table as a merchant presents a split tally stick. The air is still and carries the scent of old wood and the smell of copper coins. You see the steward examine the notches with a steady, clinical eye, ensuring they match with perfect precision. You hear the rhythmic scratching of the clerk's quill as he records the amount of the debt and the distant, muffled sound of a cart rattling through the village square. The atmosphere of the hall is one of commercial resolution. You feel a sense of profound clarity, realizing that the work of the court is preventing the village's economy from collapsing into a mess of unpaid favors. You realize that justice is the accurate counting of promises, a series of essential steps that keep the marketplace honest and the community fed. So, as we settle into the imaginary click of the tally sticks and the steady rhythm of the ledger, Remember that the story of the medieval contract is a study in the architecture of trust. It was a place where a notch was a fact and a penny was a bond. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of commerce, turning the details of a debt into a masterpiece of social reliability that would sustain the community through the leanest months of the year. The transition from economic disputes to physical altercations began with the presentment of trespasses and assaults. While these cases involved human conflict, the medieval court approached them with a methodical and clinical detachment. In the manor court, an assault was often viewed not just as a personal injury, but as a serious breach of the king's peace, a disruption of the communal order that the Lord was sworn to uphold. These trials focused on the precise documentation of the event. The goal was not to engage in retaliation, but to quantify the damage and restore the social equilibrium. The court viewed a physical blow or a broken boundary as a quantifiable error in the mechanical flow of village life, requiring a standardized correction through fines and public acknowledgement. The character of the constable or the tithing man presenting these cases was one of reliable vigilance. He was a man of the village, often a tenant of sturdy reputation, who served a one-year term. In his personal life, he was a figure of disciplined restraint, knowing that his own character had to be beyond reproach to maintain the authority of his office. He remained a man of profound procedural integrity, often living a simple, single-minded life, dedicated to the observance of his neighbors. He was not a man of aggression. His character was defined by a quiet persistence, standing as a constant barrier against disorder. His wealth was his official status, and his role in the court was to provide a standardized account of the necessary facts of the altercation. One must consider the logistics of the blood-white. In cases of physical violence, the court utilized a rigorous system of injury valuation. If a blow drew blood, it was classified as a more serious offense than a simple push. This was a study in physical forensic evidence. The jury had to verify the presence of a visible wound. The fine for drawing blood, the blood-white, was a standardized fee paid to the Lord. This was a method of economic deterrence. By attaching a specific price to violence, the court turned an impulse into a calculated financial risk. This system reinforced the predictability of the law, ensuring that everyone knew the absolute cost of losing their temper in public. The core of these trials often involved the trespass on land. This was not always about criminal intent, but frequently concerned the damaging movement of people or property across private boundaries. For example, a neighbor might have illegally driven his cart across a freshly sown field to save time. The court viewed the land as a managed resource, and any unauthorized entry was a real violation of the owner's rights. The jury would investigate the logistics of the path. Where did the cart enter, and how much grain was crushed? This was a process of damage assessment. The court would order the defendant to pay fair compensation, ensuring that the territorial integrity of the manor was respected. One must also look at the function of the hue and cry in assault. As previously mentioned, the hue and cry was the auditory alarm for the community. In cases of assault, the court was strict about whether the cry had been raised correctly. If a victim suffered a blow but did not shout for help, the court might view the case with suspicion. This was an act of procedural verification. The cry was the signal of a crime in progress. The jury would question the witnesses. Did they hear the cry, and did they immediately join the pursuit? This reinforced the collective responsibility for the peace, proving that the safety of the individual was the vital business of the whole village. The transition from physical blows to verbal conflict involved the regulation of slander and defamation. The medieval court viewed a malicious rumor as a trespass against the tongue. In a small community, a person's essential credit and standing were their most valuable assets. If someone falsely accused another of being a thief, they were presented in court. This was a form of verbal hygiene, ensuring that the stability of the village was not eroded by gossip. The court would often order the slanderer to publicly take back their words at the church door or in the marketplace. This was a symbolic restoration of the peace, proving that words have heavy legal consequences. The quirky yet profound element of trespass law was the distress of the tool. To ensure that an offender came to court to answer for a trespass, the bailiff could seize an essential tool like a spade or an axe as a pledge of attendance. The absence of a man's primary tool was a rhythmic reminder of his necessary duty to the law. The court viewed the tool as effective biological collateral. Once the defendant appeared and the fine was settled, the tool was immediately returned. It turned an everyday object into a legal instrument, proving that the mechanics of daily labor were the very gears that the law used to enforce its absolute will. You find yourself standing near the open door of the hall as a man presents a bruised arm to the jury. The air is still and carries the scent of wood smoke and the smell of damp earth. You see the steward examine the evidence with a steady, clinical eye, his face a mask of disciplined neutrality. You hear the rhythmic scratching of the clerk's quill as he records the details of the blood white and the distant, muffled sound of a dog barking in the village lane. The atmosphere of the hall is one of calculated resolution. You feel a sense of profound safety, realizing that the work of the court is preventing the village from sliding into a cycle of revenge. You realize that justice is the accurate measuring of harm, a series of essential steps that keep the king's peace and the community's heart whole. So, as we settle into the imaginary scent of the cooling air and the steady rhythm of the testimony, remember that the story of the medieval trespass is a study in the architecture of restraint. It was a place where a blow was a fine and a field was a trust. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of the law, turning the details of an altercation into a masterpiece of social order that would protect the community through the longest night. The transition from the presentation of evidence to the final determination began with the jury's deliberation. In the medieval manorial court, this was not an abstract academic exercise, but a study in communal memory. The 12 men of the jury did not retreat to a private room to discuss complex legal theories. Instead, they gathered in a tight circle, often in a corner of the hall or just outside the door, to pool their intimate knowledge of their neighbors. This was an exercise in social data processing. Because they were self-informing, they did not rely solely on the testimonies heard that day. They relied on years of constant observation. The goal was to reach a unanimous consensus that would restore the mechanical equilibrium of the village. The process was marked by a steady, rhythmic exchange of facts as each man contributed his vital piece of the truth. The character of the jury foreman was one of principled moderation. He was often a senior tenant, a man whose lengthy experience in the fields and the market made him a stable anchor for the group. In his personal life, he was a figure of disciplined silence, a man who listened more than he spoke. His character was defined by a quiet authority rather than a desire to dominate. He remained a man of profound social integrity, often living a very simple, single-minded life, dedicated to the maintenance of the custom. He was not a man of short-tempered biases. Rather, his character was one of deliberate fairness, ensuring that the necessary facts were weighed without the friction of personal grudge. His wealth was his reputation for wisdom, and his role in the circle was to serve as a human filter, turning the village gossip into a legal verdict. One must consider the logistics of the customary law. Unlike the statutes written in London, the manor court operated on the custom of the manor, an absolute set of oral traditions that governed how the land was used and how disputes were settled. This was a study in historical continuity. During deliberation, the jury had to accurately recall how similar cases had been handled since time out of mind. This was a method of temporal anchoring. If a neighbor was accused of overgrazing the common, the jury had to determine the exact number of sheep allowed by custom. This essential adherence to the past ensured that the law remained a predictable machine, providing a solid foundation for the village's future. The core of the deliberation involved the evaluation of fame and character. In the medieval world, fame, from the Latin fama, was a quantifiable legal asset. It referred to a person's public reputation. This was a study in behavioral auditing. The jury would discuss the telling history of the accused. Was he an industrious worker, or was he known to be a nightwalker who frequented the alehouse? This was a process of credit assessment. The court viewed a person's character as a form of social collateral. If a man had a clean record, the jury was more likely to accept his oath. This reinforced the behavioral standards of the community, proving that daily goodness had a real value in the eyes of the law. One must also look at the function of the unanimous verdict. The medieval court did not accept a majority vote. The jury had to be of one mind. This was an act of communal solidarity. The intense pressure to reach agreement was a study in conflict resolution. It prevented the dangerous formation of factions within the village. The jury would patiently work through their disagreements, using the weight of the facts to smooth over any resistance. This resulted in a structural harmony that made the verdict unshakable. Once the foreman announced the decision, it was seen as the voice of the community, ensuring that the necessary peace was maintained. The transition from the circle to the dais involved the presentment of the verdict. The foreman would step forward and deliver the final findings to the steward. This was a process of formalized reporting. The clerk would then translate the precise vernacular of the jury into the professional Latin of the court roll. This was a study in linguistic transformation. The details of the village dispute were now part of the permanent archive. This ensured that the work of the jury was not lost, providing a standardized record that could be used as a vital reference for the next generation. It was a rhythmic, predictable part of the afternoon, a clerical heartbeat that signaled the resolution of the conflict. The quirky, yet profound, element of deliberation was the affirmation of fines. Once the jury found a person guilty, 2 affearers, trusted men, were appointed to set the exact amount of the fine. This was a study in economic proportion. They had to ensure the fine was fair, based on the real wealth of the offender. This was an act of merciful calibration. The law did not seek to ruin a man. It sought to correct his behavior. This prevented the exploitation of the poor, turning the task of fining into a masterpiece of social balance. It proved that justice was not a cold force, but a living system of proportional accountability. You find yourself standing near the back of the hall as the jury finishes their intense whisper. The air is still and carries the scent of wood smoke and the smell of old vellum. You see the foreman step forward with a steady, deliberate pace, his face a mask of disciplined duty. You hear the rhythmic scratching of the clerk's quill as he prepares the final entry and the distant, muffled sound of a bird chirping in the manor garden. The atmosphere of the hall is one of collective resolution. You feel a sense of profound relief, realizing that the work of the jury has successfully filtered the truth from the noise. You realize that justice is the coordinated memory of the people, a series of essential steps that keep the community's heart steady and its paths straight. So, as we settle into the imaginary scent of the cooling hall and the steady rhythm of the verdict, remember that the story of the medieval jury is a study in the persistence of the group. It was a place where a whisper was a fact and a circle was a bond. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of consensus, turning the details of a deliberation into a masterpiece of social integrity that would protect the village through the change of the seasons. The transition from the verdict to the resolution of the case was defined by the system of amercement. In the medieval manorial court, the goal of punishment was rarely physical pain. Rather, it was a study in economic rebalancing. To be in mercy, in misericordia, meant that the offender was at the absolute discretion of the Lord for a financial penalty. This was an exercise in fiscal correction. Instead of retaliation, the court used the effective tool of the fine to ensure that the order of the village was restored. The process was marked by a steady, rhythmic assessment of the offender's means, ensuring that the penalty was a tangible reminder of the law's reach without causing total ruin. The character of the offerer, the official tasked with setting the final amount, was one of proportional fairness. He was usually a tenant of long standing, a man who possessed an intimate knowledge of every family's financial capacity. In his personal life, he was a figure of disciplined moderation, understanding that a fine too heavy would bankrupt a neighbor, while one too light would fail to maintain the standardized deterrence of the court. He remained a man of profound social integrity, often living a simple, single-minded life, dedicated to the maintenance of equity. He was not a man of greed. His character was defined by a quiet objectivity, weighing the necessary facts of the case against the reality of the village economy. His wealth was his reputation for impartiality, and his role was to serve as a human balance, turning the judgment into a fair transaction. One must consider the structure of penalties. Most offenses in the manor court carried predictable price tags. A failure to clean a ditch might cost 6 pence, while a more serious assault might cost 2 shillings. This was a study in predictable deterrence. This consistent scale allowed the villagers to understand the financial consequences of their actions. It transformed the law into a reliable map of behavior. There was no need for surprises. The transparency of the fine system ensured that the mechanical flow of the court was maintained. This system of monetary mapping was the primary method of social control, ensuring that the vital piece of the manor was a stable environment for the tenant. The core of the punishment phase involved the collection of the amercement. This was not an immediate payment, but a study in deferred accountability. The clerk would record the fine in the margin of the court roll, and the bailiff would later visit the homesteads to collect the funds. This was a process of administrative follow-up. If a tenant did not have the cash, they might pay in equivalent goods: a bushel of malt, a fleece of wool, or a few chickens. This was a study in commodity exchange. The court viewed these items not as clutter, but as convertible assets that maintained the necessary revenue of the estate. This reinforced the economic connectivity of the village, proving that the details of a debt could be resolved through the practical application of trade. One must also look at the function of the amerciament as a revenue stream. For the lord of the manor, the court was an essential source of income. This was an act of institutional sustainability. The constant accumulation of small fines funded the management of the estate, paying for the clerk's vellum, the bailiff's staff, and the maintenance of the hall. This was a study in administrative self-funding. However, the court had to remain fair. If the fines became an instrument of extortion, the mechanical stability of the manor would be threatened by revolt. This created a mutual incentive for order, turning the work of the court into a masterpiece of economic symbiosis. The transition from fines to communal service involved the remission of penalties. In cases of genuine poverty, the court might mercifully forgive a fine. This was a study in social safety nets. The jury would inform the steward if a widow or an injured laborer was truly unable to pay. This was an act of moral calibration. Instead of a fine, the person might be ordered to perform a necessary task for the church or the common good. This turned the punishment into a restorative action, proving that the law was interested in the rehabilitation of the individual rather than their destruction. It was a rhythmic, predictable part of the law's mercy, a procedural cooling of the heavy hand of authority. The quirky yet profound element of medieval punishment was the pledge for the fine, to ensure a certain payment. The offender had to find two neighbors to act as legal sureties for the money. This was a study in social pressure. If the offender fled or refused to pay, the debt fell upon the pledges. This was a method of peer enforcement. There was no need for pursuit. The reality of neighborly obligation ensured that the fine was settled. It turned the act of payment into a communal commitment, proving that the mechanics of the village were the very gears of justice that kept the community's heart beating in time with the law. You find yourself standing near the heavy oak chest as the day's collection begins. The air is still and carries the scent of beeswax and the smell of old wool. You see the affirers whispering with the clerk, their faces a mask of steady, disciplined calculation. You hear the rhythmic clinking of small coins hitting the wood and the distant, muffled sound of a cart moving through the courtyard. The atmosphere of the hall is one of orderly resolution. You feel a sense of profound stability, realizing that the work of the fines is keeping the village's mechanical balance intact. You realize that justice is the fair exchange of value, a series of essential steps that turn a transgression into a contribution to the common good. So, as we settle into the imaginary scent of the parchment and the steady rhythm of the counting, remember that the story of the medieval fine is a study in the architecture of fairness. It was a place where a penny was a lesson and a ledger was a map. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of correction, turning the details of a punishment into a masterpiece of social harmony that would carry the village through the cycles of the year. The transition from financial penalties to physical demonstrations of justice occurred when an offender lacked the necessary funds to pay a fine, or when the crime was of such a socially disruptive nature that it required a visible communal response. This was the system of public shame. Unlike the violence of a later era, the use of the stocks or the pillory in the medieval manor was a study in behavioral auditing. It was a method of effective social recalibration. The goal was to place the offender in a position where they were forced to face the heavy gaze of their peers. This was an exercise in reputational pressure, using the reality of community observation to discourage future breaches of the peace. The character of the beadle, who supervised these punishments, was one of strict procedural compliance. He was the official responsible for the precise operation of the wooden restraints. In his personal life, he was a figure of disciplined detachment, a man who carried out the orders of the court without cruelty or personal bias. He remained a man of profound procedural integrity, often living a single, focused life dedicated to the maintenance of the village equipment. He was not a man of aggression. His character was defined by a quiet efficiency, ensuring that the necessary task of locking the wooden beam was done with absolute accuracy. His wealth was his official reliability, and his role was to serve as a human lock, turning the court's judgment into a visible reality. One must consider the stationary restraint of the stocks. The stocks were a sturdy wooden frame designed to hold the offender by the ankles. This was a study in physical immobilization. The offenders sat on a low bench, their legs extended through precisely carved holes in a heavy timber beam. While simple in its design, it was a highly effective way to ensure the individual remained in a specific location for a set duration, usually from sunrise to sunset. The court viewed this not as a form of torture, but as a time-limited exclusion from the normal flow of village life. It was a rhythmic, predictable part of the social machine, providing a visible anchor for the law's authority and allowing the community to witness the consequences of deviance. The core of the pillory, by contrast, involved the restraint of the upper body. The pillory held the head and hands, forcing the offender to stand upright. This was a study in visual exposure. It was often reserved for deceptive crimes, such as selling underweight bread or sour ale. The court believed that since the crime was a public fraud, the correction should be a public identification. This was a process of identity verification. By standing in the pillory, the offender became a recognizable warning to all who passed through the marketplace. This reinforced the behavioral standards of the community, proving that a dishonest reputation was a heavy burden to carry in the eyes of the village. One must also look at the management of fixed durations. The time spent in these public restraints was strictly regulated by the court. This was an act of temporal calibration. A person might be ordered to sit in the stocks for 2 hours during the market or for the specific duration of the Sunday morning service. This was a study in symbolic timing. The court utilized the predictable schedule of village life to ensure the maximum impact of the punishment. This ensured that the correction was proportional to the offense, turning the passage of time into a powerful tool for the restoration of order. It prevented the extension of the penalty beyond the legal limit set by the steward. The transition from physical restraint to communal interaction involved the regulation of the crowd. While the offender was in the stocks, the community was legally allowed to observe them. However, the law was firm about preventing violence. This was a study in crowd discipline. While vocal mockery was common, the official presence of the constable ensured that no physical harm came to the prisoner. This was a form of supervised shaming, ensuring that the punishment remained a legal process rather than a riot. It transformed the village square into a controlled theater of justice, proving that the absolute authority of the court extended even to the emotional reactions of the public. The quirky yet profound element of public shame was the sign of the crime. In some cases, the creative court would order the offender to hold a symbolic object while in the pillory. A dishonest baker might have a light loaf of bread hung round his neck, or a fraudulent vintner might have his sour wine poured over his head. This was a study in iconographic justice. It made the specific nature of the crime instantly clear to even the most illiterate observer. This was a method of instructional punishment, turning the details of a legal breach into a memorable lesson for the whole manor. It proved that the vital health of the community relied on the clarity of the record. You find yourself standing at the edge of the marketplace as the sun reaches its zenith. The air is still and carries the scent of dust and the smell of seasoned oak. You see the beadle standing near the stocks, his face a mask of steady, disciplined observation. You hear the rhythmic clack of the wooden beam being locked into place, and the distant, muffled sound of a cart being loaded for the trip home. The atmosphere of the square is one of heavy, public resolution. You feel a sense of profound order, realizing that the work of the stocks is repairing the damaged fabric of the community. You realize that justice is the visible correction of behavior, a series of essential steps that keep the village honest and the paths of the law straight. So, as we settle into the imaginary scent of the weathered wood and the steady rhythm of the market day, remember that the story of the medieval stocks is a study in the architecture of shame. It was a place where a beam was a boundary and a gaze was a fine. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of public accountability, turning the details of a punishment into a masterpiece of social integrity that would protect the manor through the cycles of the day. The transition from the village square to the shaded boundaries of the manor began with the enforcement of the forest law. To the modern eye, the woods might seem like a place of wild freedom, but in the medieval world, they were a strictly managed and vital resource. The forest was not merely a collection of trees, it was a study in biological assets. Every branch of timber, every patch of grazing vert, and every head of deer was protected by a rigorous set of regulations. These trials were not about the thrill of the hunt, but about the precise calculation of loss. The court viewed an unauthorized entry into the Lord's woods as a significant theft of potential revenue and ecological stability. The proceedings were marked by a steady, rhythmic cataloging of illicit woodcutting and illegal snares. The character of the woodward, or the parker, was one of stealthy vigilance. He was the official responsible for the constant patrolling of the woodland boundaries. In his personal life, he was a figure of disciplined solitude, spending more time with the rhythm of the seasons than with the people of the village. He remained a man of profound environmental integrity, often living a single, focused life in a small lodge on the edge of the forest. He was not a man of aggression. His character was defined by a quiet patience, moving through the undergrowth with absolute silence to catch those who ignored the law. His wealth was his intimate knowledge of the terrain, and his role in the court was to serve as a human map, turning the hidden signs of poaching into a standardized legal record. One must consider the classification of vert and venison. The foundational rules of the forest were divided into these two categories. Vert referred to the essential greenery, the wood, the turf, and the mast for pigs. Venison referred to the high-value game, specifically the deer. This was a study in resource management. A tenant caught with an illegal load of dry firewood faced a different specific fine than one caught with a poached buck. The court utilized this clear distinction to maintain the logistics of ownership. It transformed the forest into a highly organized warehouse, ensuring that the flow of fuel and food was strictly controlled according to the ancient customs of the manor. The core of these trials often involved the regulation of the purlieu. This was the complex boundary zone between the private forest and the common lands. This was a study in geographic friction. Poaching often occurred not in the deep woods, but in these sensitive borderlands where animals might wander onto a tenant's field. The jury had to investigate the capture process. Did the tenant actively lure the deer, or was it an accidental trespass? This was a process of intent verification. The court utilized the reliable testimonies of the woodward to determine the truth. This reinforced the spatial authority of the Lord, proving that the invisible lines of the forest law were as solid as the stone walls of the manor hall. One must also look at the function of the attachments of the forest. When a person was caught in the woods with suspicious equipments such as a bow, a hound, or a hidden net, they were attached by their body or their goods. This was an act of preventative restraint. The woodward would seize the offending items and present them at the next necessary court session. This was a study in evidence retention. The court viewed these objects as undeniable proof of an intended crime. This system ensured that the persistent temptation of the greenwood was met with a standardized response, turning the act of carrying a tool into a heavy legal liability. The transition from poaching to land management involved the licensing of the pannage. This was the essential practice of allowing pigs to eat fallen acorns in the Lord's woods. This was a study in agricultural coordination. The court regulated the exact dates when the pigs could enter and the fair price per head that the tenants had to pay. This was an act of economic integration. By turning the cycle of the oak tree into a taxable event, the court maintained the structural stability of the village food supply. It proved that the vital health of the manor relied on the managed exploitation of the forest, turning a natural process into a masterpiece of effective administrative order. The quirky, yet profound, element of forest law was the expeditation of dogs to protect the Lord's deer from being chased. All large dogs kept by tenants within the forest boundaries had to have specific claws removed from their front feet. This was a study in biological disablement. The necessary check of the village dogs was a rhythmic part of the rigorous forest inspections. The court viewed an unexpedited dog as a dangerous threat to the venison. This was a method of predictive policing, ensuring that the constant safety of the game was maintained through the physical modification of the community's animals. It proved that the law was absolute, extending even to the paws of a pet. You find yourself standing on the mossy edge of the woods as the sun begins to set. The air is still and carries the scent of damp leaves and the smell of pine resin. You see the woodward presenting an illegal snare to the steward, his face a mask of steady, disciplined duty. You hear the rhythmic scratching of the clerk's quill as he records the fine for vert and venison and the distant, muffled sound of an owl hooting in the dark canopy. The atmosphere of the forest edge is one of heavy, silent regulation. You feel a sense of profound order, realizing that the work of the forest law is protecting the vital lungs of the manor. You realize that justice is the careful guarding of the wild, a series of essential steps that keep the trees standing and the deer safe. So, as we settle into the imaginary scent of the cooling earth and the steady rhythm of the woodward's stride, remember that the story of the medieval forest is a study in the architecture of management. It was a place where a branch was a fee and a track was a record. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of conservation, turning the details of a woodland dispute into a masterpiece of social and environmental balance that would sustain the manor through the winters to come. The transition from slow-moving forest laws to the rapid pace of commerce occurred at the gates of the marketplace, where the vital Peapowder Court was held. The name itself is a study in clerical pragmatism, derived from the French pides powders, or dusty feet. Unlike the Manorial Court, which met only a few times a year, this was an immediate form of justice, designed for traveling merchants who could not wait weeks for a verdict. This was a study in temporal efficiency. These courts operated while the dust was still on the merchants' boots, providing necessary speed to the legal process. The goal was to resolve disputes before the fair ended and the participants vanished down the long roads of the kingdom. The character of the market clerk was one of analytical speed. He was a man of intense focus, sitting at a temporary table amidst the noise of livestock and shouting traders. In his personal life, he was a figure of disciplined transience, often moving from fair to fair to ensure the consistent application of the law. He remained a man of profound commercial integrity, often living a simple, single-minded life, dedicated to the standardized measurement of truth. He was not prone to reactions. His character was defined by a quiet efficiency, processing complex claims of fraudulent wool or unpaid tolls with absolute accuracy. His wealth was his specialized knowledge of trade custom, and his role was to serve as a human ledger, turning the chaos of the market into a standardized legal record. One must consider the coordination of the fair bond. Because the court moved so quickly, it relied on a rigorous system of immediate pledges. If a merchant was accused of a serious breach of contract, they had to provide security right then and there. This was a study in economic velocity. This effective mechanism ensured that the defendant would not simply pack their valuable wares and leave the jurisdiction before the sun went down. The court utilized these bonds as guarantees of the law's presence. This turned the marketplace into a highly regulated environment, where the constant fear of losing one's bond kept the competitive interactions of the traders within the bounds of the law. The core of these trials often involved the verification of the toll. Every merchant entering the fair was legally required to pay for the right to sell. This was a study in commercial access. Disputes often arose over specific exemptions. Some towns had ancient charters that allowed their citizens to trade toll-free. The court had to investigate the pedigree of the trader. Could the merchant definitively prove their origin? This was a process of documentary validation. The clerk would examine vital letters of passage with a clinical eye. This reinforced the fiscal authority of the fair's owner, proving that the invisible lines of privilege were the gears of the market that determined who profited and who paid. One must also look at the function of the broker and the witness. In the fast-paced world of the Peapowder Court, professional brokers often acted as the primary witnesses to a deal. This was an act of institutional memory. These men were legally bound to remember the exact price and quality of goods exchanged. This was a study in transactional transparency. If a buyer claimed the expensive silk was damaged, the broker provided the neutral testimony needed to reach a verdict. This system ensured that the persistent risks of long-distance trade were mitigated by a standardized observation system. turning the presence of a third party into a heavy legal safeguard for every bargain. The transition from individual disputes to market health involved the inspection of wares. The court officials, known as searchers, would methodically move through the stalls to identify deceptive practices. This included the dangerous act of dubbing, putting the high-quality fruit on top of a basket while the rotten goods were hidden below. This was a study in quality control. The court viewed these fraudulent acts as a breach of market trust. If caught, the offending goods were often publicly burned and the merchant was fined. This was a form of market hygiene, ensuring that the vital reputation of the fair was not tarnished by the greed of a few individuals. The quirky, yet profound, element of the pea powder court was the handstroke agreement. To seal a binding deal in the market, the parties would strike their hands together in the presence of witnesses. This was a study in physical contractualism. The court viewed this loud gesture as the finalization of the sale. Once the hands had struck, the legal deal was done. This was a method of instantaneous legal recognition. There was no need for slow paperwork. The visible action was the record. It turned a human movement into a legal lock, proving that the rhythmic interactions of the marketplace were the very logic that kept the economy of the kingdom moving forward. You find yourself standing at the edge of the market square as the afternoon sun glints off the sharp scales of the woolwares. The air is still and carries the scent of roasted meat and the smell of damp canvas. You see the market clerk writing with a steady, disciplined speed, his face a mask of unwavering concentration. You hear the rhythmic clack-clack of the wooden tally sticks and the distant, muffled sound of a trumpet announcing the official close of the day's trade. The atmosphere of the fair is one of heavy, efficient resolutions. You feel a sense of profound order, realizing that the work of the pea powder court is preventing the vital trade of the world from descending into chaos. You realize that justice is the rapid calibration of truth, a series of essential steps that keep the merchants moving and the markets honest. So, as we settle into the imaginary scent of the dusty road and the steady rhythm of the market stalls, remember that the story of the pea powder court is a study in the architecture of speed. It was a place where a handstroke was a law and a boot was a clock. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of rapid justice, turning the details of a market dispute into a masterpiece of social and economic stability that would carry the merchants safely to the next town. The transition from the earthly marketplace to the spiritual realm was governed by the church courts, often referred to as the body courts, due to their rigorous focus on moral conduct. While the manor court handled land and debt, the church court managed the governance of the spirit. These sessions were typically held within the local parish church or a cathedral, creating an environment of solemn authority. This was a study in moral maintenance, ensuring that every parishioner adhered to the religious and ethical standards of the age. The goal was not merely to punish, but to achieve the reconciliation of the individual with the community and the divine. The proceedings were marked by a steady, rhythmic inquiry into the private lives of the villagers, turning personal behavior into a matter of public record. The character of the archdeacon or the official who presided was one of theological precision. He was a man of deep learning, a figure who understood the complex interplay between canon law and local tradition. In his personal life, he was a figure of disciplined piety, knowing that his own conduct served as a primary model for the faithful. He remained a man of profound spiritual integrity, often living a life of dedicated study and prayer. He was not a man of judgment. Rather, his character was defined by a quiet discernment, weighing the nuances of a confession with absolute care. His wealth was found in his ecclesiastical rank, and his role in the court was to serve as a guardian of the conscience, turning the intangible struggles of the soul into a standardized path for penance. One must consider the coordination of the tithe. This was the foundational economic engine of the church, requiring every tenant to give a tenth of their produce grain, wool, or livestock to support the parish. This was a study in agricultural accountability. Disputes often arose over the precise calculation of the tenth. The court had to investigate the production process. Had the grain been measured correctly? Was the lamb selected for the tithe of sufficient quality? This was a process of economic verification. The court utilized these trials to maintain the structural stability of the parish infrastructure. It transformed the fields into a managed resource for the church, ensuring that the physical support of the clergy was maintained through the consistent application of religious law. The core of these trials often involved the regulation of moral conduct. This included everything from defamation and scolding to more serious breaches of the marriage vow. This was a study in social hygiene. The court believed that private sin had public consequences, threatening the spiritual health of the entire village. The jury of sidesmen, trusted local men, would report those who neglected their religious duties or engaged in disruptive behavior. This was a process of behavioral surveillance. The court would often order effective acts of penance, such as standing at the church door in a white sheet to ask for the community's forgiveness. This was a form of symbolic restoration, proving that the law was a tool for the mending of the social fabric. One must also look at the function of the testamentary record. The church courts held the exclusive right to prove wills and oversee the distribution of a deceased person's movable goods. This was an act of intergenerational coordination. The clerk would record the vital inventories of kettles, blankets, and tools left to heirs. This was a study in property continuity. The court had to ensure that the sincere wishes of the dying were respected, and that the necessary taxes, the mortuary payment to the church, were collected. This reinforced the legal presence of the church at every stage of life, proving that the management of the dead was as essential as the guidance of the living. The transition from local behavior to theological boundaries involved the inquiry into heresy. While rare in small manors, the court was constantly vigilant for dangerous deviations from orthodox belief. This was a study in intellectual calibration. If a person questioned the nature of the sacraments or the authority of the clergy, they were brought before the court to abjure their errors. This was a process of cognitive alignment. The court viewed heresy as a structural flaw in the community's faith. The steward and the clergy worked with methodical patience to bring the offender back into the fold. This system ensured that the doctrinal unity of the village remained intact, turning the details of a theological debate into a masterpiece of social and spiritual cohesion. The quirky yet profound element of church justice was the purgation by oath to clear one's name of a moral charge. A person could be required to find a set number of compurgators, neighbors who would swear that they believed the defendant was telling the truth. This was a study in reputational weight. The court viewed the collective oath as a mechanical proof of innocence. If the defendant could find 12 honest men to swear for him, he was purged. This was a method of social validation. It proved that in the medieval world, a person's standing was their strongest shield. It turned the vital act of neighboring into a legal force, ensuring that the community remained the ultimate judge of an individual's character. You find yourself standing in the cool, dim nave of the church as a woman performs her penance. The air is still and carries the scent of incense and the smell of cold stone. You see the archdeacon watching with a steady, disciplined gaze, his face a mask of solemn responsibility. You hear the rhythmic scratching of the clerk's quill as he records the final act of reconciliation and the distant, muffled sound of the church bell tolling for the afternoon prayer. The atmosphere of the church is one of heavy, spiritual order. You feel a sense of profound peace, realizing that the work of the church court is keeping the village's heart clean. You realize that justice is the constant tuning of the soul, a series of essential steps that keep the community in harmony with the heavens. So, as we settle into the imaginary scent of the beeswax and the steady rhythm of the liturgy, remember that the story of the church court is a study in the architecture of the spirit. It was a place where a word was a vow and a sheet was a lesson. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of moral discipline, turning the details of a spiritual dispute into a masterpiece of social integrity that would protect the parish through the change of the ages. The transition from the spiritual discipline of the church to the physical reality of the earth occurred in the management of land tenure. In the medieval manor, land was not merely dirt, it was a study in productive stratification. The fundamental unit of this system was the virgat, a measurement of land roughly equal to 30 acres. Though this varied depending on the soil quality, this was an exercise in agricultural partitioning. A tenant did not hold their virgat as a single fenced-off block. Instead, their land was scattered across the 3 great open fields of the village in long, narrow strips. This was a method of geographic risk distribution, ensuring that every family had a share of both the fertile valley soil and the thinner earth of the slopes. The proceedings of the court were marked by a steady, rhythmic verification of these boundaries, turning the layout of the fields into a masterpiece of social and economic survival. The character of the Hayward was one of sustained boundary vigilance. He was the official responsible for the precise oversight of the hedges, fences, and the balks, the narrow, unplowed strips of turf that separated one man's land from his neighbor's. In his personal life, he was a figure of disciplined observation, spending his days walking the perimeter of the ripening grain. He remained a man of profound spatial integrity, often living a single, focused life, dedicated to the standardized maintenance of the open field. He was not a man of reactions. His character was defined by a quiet firmness, ensuring that no plow encroached upon the common path. His wealth was his reputation for geometric accuracy, and his role in the court was to serve as a human ruler, turning the physical reality of the soil into a permanent legal entry. One must consider the governance of the 3-field system. This was the foundational engine of medieval life, a study in nutritional rotation. The court regulated which field would be planted with winter wheat, which with spring barley, and which would remain fallow to recover its strength. This was a method of biological sustainability. If a tenant refused to follow the collective rotation, they were presented in court and fined. The court utilized these trials to maintain the structural stability of the village food supply. It transformed the landscape into a highly organized machine, ensuring that the cycle of growth and rest was maintained through the consistent application of manorial custom. This was an act of environmental coordination on a massive scale. The core of these trials often involved the inheritance of the holding. When a tenant died, the court managed the intergenerational transfer of the verdict. This was a study in legal continuity. The heir, usually the eldest son, had to appear in court to pay a heriot, a death duty, often the best beast on the farm, and an entry fine to take up the land. This was a process of succession validation. The court had to ensure that the newcomer was capable of performing the necessary labor services required by the lord. This reinforced the economic stability of the manor, proving that the land was a trust passed from one hand to another under the watchful eye of the law. It turned the cycle of life and death into a standardized administrative event. One must also look at the function of the acre strip. Because the strips were long and narrow, the distance an ox team could plow before needing a rest, they were known as warlongs. The court was frequently called upon to resolve disputes where one tenant had accidentally plowed too far into another's strip. This was an act of incremental theft. The jury of neighbors would walk the fields to identify the shift in the balk. This was a process of physical rectification. The court would order the boundary stones to be reset and a fine to be paid. This preserved the spatial integrity of the holdings, ensuring that the complex map of the village remained a reliable record of ownership. The transition from individual strips to the communal resource involved the regulation of the common pasture. Once the harvest was gathered, the stubble was opened to the village livestock. This was a study in collective grazing. The court set the stint, the exact number of sheep or cows each tenant was allowed to put on the common. This was an act of ecological protection. If a wealthy tenant tried to surcharge the common by bringing in too many animals, they were presented by the Hayward. This system ensured that the pastoral resources were not exhausted by greed, turning the shared fields into a managed commons that sustained the livestock of the entire community through the lean months. The quirky yet profound element of land law was the livery of season. To finalize a land transfer, the parties would go to the field itself. The seller would hand the buyer a piece of turf or a twig from the land. This was a study in tactile legalism. The court viewed this physical contact with the earth as the moment of transfer. This was a method of visible verification. There was no need for complex parchment maps. The dirt itself was the evidence. It turned a simple human gesture into a binding contract, proving that the relationship between the people and the soil was the primary gear that kept the world of the manor turning. It was a rhythmic, predictable part of the law, a manual pulse that anchored the community to its foundation. You find yourself standing on a high ridge, overlooking the sea of grain as the sun begins to dip. The air is still and carries the scent of ripening stalks and the smell of freshly turned earth. You see the Hayward pointing out a disputed balk to the steward, his face a mask of steady, disciplined duty. You hear the rhythmic shushes of the wind through the wheat and the distant, muffled sound of a plowman calling to his team. The atmosphere of the fields is one of heavy, organized growth. You feel a sense of profound security, realizing that the work of the land court is preventing the village from falling into starvation. You realize that justice is the accurate measurement of the earth, a series of essential steps that keep the furrows straight and the harvests sure. So, as we settle into the imaginary scent of the clover and the steady rhythm of the ox team, remember that the story of the medieval vergate is a study in the architecture of the landscape. It was a place where a strip was a life and a turf was a bond. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of husbandry, turning the details of a field dispute into a masterpiece of social and agricultural stability that would feed the manor through the winters of 1,000 years. The transition from the ownership of the land to the physical cultivation of the soil involved the management of labor services. In the medieval manorial system, the relationship between the lord and the tenant was not defined by a simple cash rent, but by a study in obligatory energy. The week work was the foundational requirement for most unfree tenants, necessitating that they provide 2 or 3 days of labor each week on the lord's personal land, known as the domain. This was an exercise in human resource allocation. The court acted as the primary regulator of this energy, ensuring that every plow was manned and every hedge was trimmed according to the seasonal needs of the estate. The proceedings were marked by a steady, rhythmic auditing of the labor rolls, turning the physical sweat of the village into a masterpiece of organized production. The character of the Reeve was one of persistent operational oversight. He was the most important official chosen from among the peasantry, a man who acted as the vital bridge between the lord's interests and the villagers' reality. In his personal life, he was a figure of disciplined multitasking, managing his own verget while simultaneously tracking the work of dozens of his neighbors. He remained a man of profound logistical integrity, often living a single-minded life dedicated to the standardized fulfillment of service. He was not a man of demands. His character was defined by a quiet firmness, standing in the fields at dawn to ensure the boonworks were populated. His wealth was his reputation for reliability, and his role in the court was to serve as a human clock, turning the passage of hours into a permanent record of fulfilled duty. One must consider the governance of the boonwork. While week work was the regular routine, boonworks were special, additional days of labor required during the critical periods of the agricultural year, such as the haymaking or the harvest. This was a study in peak demand management. The court issued the necessary proclamations for these boons, and the entire village was expected to respond. This was a method of communal mobilization. If a tenant failed to appear for a harvest boon, they were presented in court and fined. The court utilized these trials to maintain the structural stability of the food supply. It transformed the population into a highly synchronized workforce, ensuring that the grain was gathered before the autumn rains through the consistent application of customary law. The core of these trials often involved the quality of the labor. It was not enough to simply show up. The work had to be performed to a specific standard. This was a study in functional accountability. A tenant might be presented in court for plowing too shallow or for neglecting the lord's sheep. This was a process of operational auditing. The jury, acting on the report of the Reeve, would investigate the nature of the failure. Was the plow broken, or was the laborer simply inattentive? The court viewed poor work as a breach of the service contract. This reinforced the behavioral standards of the manor, proving that the survival of the community relied on the competent execution of tasks. It turned the act of manual labor into a standardized legal obligation. One must also look at the function of the commutation of service. As the medieval economy evolved, some tenants sought to pay a fine in cash to be excused from their physical labor. This was an act of economic transformation. The court managed this process, determining the fair market value of a day's work. This was a study in fiscal calibration. If a tenant paid 6 pence for a day's reaping, the lord could then use that money to hire a seasonal laborer. This provided a necessary flexibility to the system, allowing for the gradual shift from a labor-based economy to a cash-based one. This was a rhythmic, predictable part of the court's business, ensuring that the management of wealth was as efficient as the management of the plow. The transition from the fields to the domestic sphere involved the regulation of female labor. While the heavy plowing was often male-dominated, women performed essential boon tasks such as winnowing grain, shearing sheep, and gathering wool. This was a study in gendered resource integration. The court ensured that these contributions were recorded and credited against the family's total labor obligation. This was a method of household accountability. If a family failed to send the required number of workers to the Lord's sheep clipping, they faced the same specific penalties as those who missed the plowing. This reinforced the collective nature of the tenure, proving that the entire household was anchored to the Lord through the practical application of their strength. The quirky yet profound element of labor law was the love boon. This was a special harvest day where the Lord provided a feast of bread, ale, and perhaps a piece of meat or cheese in exchange for the extra work. This was a study in ritualized reciprocity. The court viewed the love boon as a vital tool for maintaining social cohesion. While the labor was mandatory, the shared meal served as a symbolic acknowledgement of the mutual dependence between the Lord and the people. It turned a day of intense physical toil into a communal event, proving that the mechanics of the manor were greased by the occasional act of hospitality. It was a masterpiece of human management, ensuring that the hard work of the harvest ended with a sense of shared accomplishment. You find yourself standing at the edge of the domain fields as the sun reaches its height. The air is still and carries the scent of cut grass and the smell of hard-working animals. You see the Reeve moving with a steady, disciplined pace among the reapers, his eyes scanning for any sign of a missed stroke. You hear the rhythmic swishes of the scythes and the distant, muffled sound of a water jug being passed among the men. The atmosphere of the afternoon is one of heavy, coordinated effort. You feel a sense of profound order, realizing that the work of the labor court is turning the potential of the village into the reality of the bread. You realize that justice is the fair distribution of effort, a series of essential steps that keep the community moving and the granaries full. So, as we settle into the imaginary scent of the golden hay and the steady rhythm of the scythe, remember that the story of the medieval weekwork is a study in the architecture of energy. It was a place where a day was a debt and a feast was a bond. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of labor, turning the details of a day's work into a masterpiece of social and economic stability that would carry the manor through the harvest and into the rest of the winter. The transition from the harvest fields to the finished loaf of bread was governed by the soak of the mill. In the medieval manor, the watermill or windmill was not merely a piece of machinery. It was a study in technological monopoly. By manorial law, all tenants were required to grind their corn at the Lord's mill. This was an exercise in industrial centralization. The court acted as the primary regulator of this process, ensuring that the multure, the fee taken by the miller in the form of a portion of the grain, was accurately measured. The proceedings were marked by a steady, rhythmic inquiry into the honesty of the mill, turning the basic necessity of flour into a masterpiece of administrative oversight and economic control. The character of the miller was one of complex social standing. Because he controlled the village food supply and handled everyone's grain, he was often viewed with a mixture of necessity and deep-seated suspicion. In his personal life, he was a figure of mechanical focus, his days spent within the rhythmic rumble of the grinding stones and the rush of the leat. He remained a man of profound technical integrity, often living a single disciplined life in the mill house, isolated by the constant noise of his trade. He was not a man of reactions. His character was defined by a quiet calculation, weighing the grain with a practiced hand. His wealth was his specialized skill, and his role in the court was to serve as a human filter, turning the raw harvest of the fields into the refined substance of survival. One must consider the regulation of the toll. The standard multure was typically 1/16 or 1/24 of the grain brought to the mill. This was a study in volumetric taxation. Disputes frequently arose over whether the miller was using a cheating dish to take more than his legal share. This was a method of commercial accountability. The court required the miller's measures to be periodically checked against the standardized vessels kept in the manor hall. If a miller was caught with a fraudulent measure, they were presented in court and heavily fined. The court utilized these trials to maintain the social stability of the village, ensuring that the most essential ingredient of the peasant diet was not compromised by individual greed. The core of these trials often involved the offense of suit of mill. This occurred when a tenant tried to bypass the lord's monopoly by grinding their grain at home with a handquern or taking it to a rival mill outside the manor. This was a study in contractual enforcement. The court viewed the suit of mill as a vital part of the tenant's obligation to the lord. If the bailiff discovered a hidden handmill in a cottage, the stones were often seized and brought to the court as physical evidence of the trespass. This was a process of monopoly protection. The court would order the destruction of the handmill and fine the tenant, proving that the economic infrastructure of the manor was an absolute system that could not be circumvented. One must also look at the function of the mill repairs. Because the mill was a complex piece of engineering, its maintenance was a collective responsibility. This was an act of structural preservation. The court managed the boon days, specifically dedicated to the heavy labor of hauling new millstones from the coast or repairing the timber dam. This was a study in mechanical coordination. If the mill stood idle due to neglect, the entire village suffered. The jury would report any tenant who failed to provide their cart for the carriage of the stones. This reinforced the interdependence of the community, proving that the movement of the wheel was the result of the coordinated energy of every household on the manor. The transition from the machinery to the product involved the control of the baker. Once the grain was ground, the court's oversight shifted to the Assize of Bread. This was a study in product standardization. To prevent the exploitation of the poor, the law set the weight and price of loaves based on the current price of wheat. The alatasters and breadweighers would visit the ovens to ensure that the boring but vital rules of the assize were being followed. If a baker sold bread that was light of weight or poor of brand, they were subjected to the public correction of the pillory. This was a form of market hygiene, ensuring that the final link in the food chain remained as honest as the initial plowing of the field. The quirky, yet profound element of mill law was the millpool fishing. The water held behind the mill dam was a valuable secondary resource, often teeming with eels and fish. The court strictly regulated who could cast a net in these waters. This was a study in ancillary resource management. If a miller was caught taking fish that belonged to the lord's table, he was presented for trespass of the water. this was a method of ecological policing. It proved that every aspect of the mill's operation, from the air that turned the sails to the water that flowed through the wheel, was a managed asset, turning a simple natural force into a masterpiece of legal and economic order. You find yourself standing on the wooden bridge leading to the mill as the sun reaches its zenith. The air is still and carries the scent of damp moss and the sweet, heavy smell of fresh flour. You see the miller adjusting the flow of the water, his face a mask of steady, disciplined focus. You hear the rhythmic thump-thump of the great stones and the distant, muffled sound of a cart loaded with sacks approaching from the village. The atmosphere of the mill site is one of heavy, industrious permanence. You feel a sense of profound stability, realizing that the work of the mill court is ensuring that every grain is accounted for. You realize that justice is the accurate processing of the harvest, a series of essential steps that keep the wheels turning and the village fed. So, as we settle into the imaginary vibration of the floorboards and the steady rhythm of the grinding, remember that the story of the medieval miller is a study in the architecture of industry. It was a place where a stone was a law and a measure was a trust. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of regulation, turning the details of a grinding fee into a masterpiece of social and economic order that would sustain the community through the hunger of the spring. The transition from the refined operations of the mill to the raw resources of the landscape involved the management of isvers. In the medieval legal framework, isvers referred to the essential right of a tenant to take wood from the lord's estate for specific, practical purposes. This was not a license for indiscriminate cutting, but a study in material classification. The law divided these rights into three precise categories: houseboat for repairing cottages, plowboat for maintaining agricultural implements, and fireboat for essential heating and cooking. The court acted as the primary regulator of this extraction, ensuring that the physical assets of the manor were used without depleting the forest for future generations. The proceedings were marked by a steady, rhythmic auditing of the woodland, turning the gathering of sticks into a masterpiece of environmental and social coordination. The character of the Hayward, who oversaw the hedges and the fringes of the wood, was one of analytical observation. He was the official tasked with ensuring that no tenant took more than their reasonable share of the timber. In his personal life, he was a figure of disciplined restraint, walking the boundary lines with a practiced eye for the health of the trees. He remained a man of profound ecological integrity, often living a single, focused life dedicated to the standardized preservation of the resource. He was not a man of accusations. His character was defined by a quiet vigilance, marking the trees that could be felled and those that had to be spared. His wealth was his reputation for fairness, and his role in the court was to serve as a human filter, turning the act of gathering fuel into a permanent legal record of communal rights. One must consider the regulation of fireboat. For the medieval peasant, the ability to heat a home and cook food was a matter of survival. The court strictly defined what could be taken for fuel, usually limited to underwood or dead wood that could be gathered by hook or by crook, meaning only what could be reached with a shepherd's crook or cut with a small hook. This was a study in scale limitation. If a tenant was caught felling a healthy, mature oak for firewood, they were presented in court for a trespass of the greenwood. This was a method of resource protection. The court utilized these trials to maintain the structural stability of the manor's timber supply, ensuring that the vital heat of the hearth did not come at the expense of the lord's long-term capital. The core of these trials often involved the verification of houseboat. When a tenant's cottage required structural repair, they had to petition the court for the necessary timber. This was a study in functional necessity. The court would send a jury of neighbors to inspect the building and confirm that the increased wood was truly needed for repair rather than for sale or expansion. This was a process of operational auditing. If the timber was granted, the tenant was legally bound to use it for that specific purpose. If the bailiff found the houseboat timber sitting in a merchant's yard, the tenant faced a heavy fine. This reinforced the behavioral standards of the manor, proving that the lord's wood was a shared trust meant only for the maintenance of the tenement. One must also look at the function of the hedge breach. Hedges were more than just markers. They were the living fences that protected the crops from livestock. The right to take hayboat allowed tenants to cut thorns and brush to repair these barriers. This was an act of infrastructure coordination. If a tenant neglected their section of the hedge, allowing cattle to enter the grain fields, they were presented in court. This was a study in derivative accountability. The court viewed a broken hedge as a mechanical failure of the community's defenses. The jury would report the boring but vital details of the gaps and the names of those responsible for the heavy labor of weaving the branches. This ensured that the spatial integrity of the fields was maintained through the collective effort of the village. The transition from extraction to conservation involved the control of the mast. During the autumn, the woods provided mast, acorns, and beechnut switch were essential for fattening the village pigs. The court regulated the pannage season, determining exactly when the pigs could enter the woods and the specific fee per head. This was a study in nutritional timing. If a tenant allowed their pigs into the woods before the official ringing of the bell, they were fined. This was a form of biological management, ensuring that the pigs did not disturb the young saplings or compete with the lord's deer. It transformed the seasonal cycle of the forest into a standardized economic event, proving that even the fallen nuts were a managed asset of the manor. The quirky, yet profound, element of Istavar's law was the view of the wood. Periodically, the entire court would process into the forest to conduct a physical inventory. This was a study in tactile verification. The steward, the clerk, and the jury would walk the groves, counting the timber and checking for illegal clearings. This was a method of environmental accounting. There was no need for abstract maps. The view provided a direct record of the manor's health. It turned a walk in the woods into a legal inspection, proving that the relationship between the people and the trees was the very gears of order that kept the village warm and the houses standing. It was a rhythmic, predictable part of the law, a seasonal pulse that anchored the community to its natural foundation. You find yourself standing at the edge of a coppice as the afternoon sun glints through the hazel branches. The air is still and carries the scent of damp earth and the sweet, heavy smell of freshly cut wood. You see the Hayward marking a bundle of faggots with the Lord's seal, his face a mask of steady, disciplined focus. You hear the rhythmic thwack-thwack of a billhook and the distant, muffled sound of a cart loaded with brushwood moving toward the village. The atmosphere of the woodlot is one of heavy, organized utility. You feel a sense of profound stability, realizing that the work of the Istavar's court is ensuring that the village has the tools to survive. You realize that justice is the accurate distribution of the forest, a series of essential steps that keep the hearths burning and the fences strong. So, as we settle into the imaginary scent of the wood smoke and the steady rhythm of the gathering, remember that the story of the medieval Istovers is a study in the architecture of resources. It was a place where a twig was a right and an oak was a trust. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of conservation, turning the details of a woodland right into a masterpiece of social and ecological balance that would sustain the community through the winters of history. The transition from the raw materials of the field and forest to the primary beverage of the village involved the Assize of Ale. In a world where water was often unreliable, ale was not a luxury. It was a study in liquid nutrition. Because it was an essential staple, the court acted as the primary regulator of its quality, price, and measurement. Every village brewer, often a woman known as an alewife, was subject to the rigorous standards of the manor. This was an exercise in consumer standardization. The court ensured that the community was not exploited by pricing or diluted ingredients. The proceedings were marked by a steady, rhythmic auditing of the brewing vessels, turning the fermentation process into a masterpiece of public health and economic oversight. The character of the altaster was one of specialized sensory integrity. He was a local official, appointed by the court, tasked with visiting every house where an ale stake, a pole with a bush or garland, was displayed to signal a fresh brew. In his personal life, he was a figure of disciplined moderation, for his role required a clear palate and a firm commitment to the law. He remained a man of profound procedural integrity, often living a single, focused life, dedicated to the standardized quality of the village pint. He was not a man of excess. His character was defined by a quiet objectivity, testing the clarity and strength of the malt. His wealth was his official reputation, and his role in the court was to serve as a human gauge, turning the taste of the ale into a permanent legal record. One must consider the regulation of the price. The price of ale was not set by the brewer, but was legally tied to the current price of grain. This was a study in economic correlation. If the price of barley rose, the court allowed a corresponding increase in the cost of a gallon. If it fell, the price had to drop. This was a method of market stabilization. If a brewer was caught selling dear ale above the legal limit, they were presented in court and fined. The court utilized these trials to maintain the social stability of the manor, ensuring that the most basic source of hydration remained affordable for the poorest laborer. This system of price indexing was the primary gear that kept the village marketplace honest and accessible. The core of these trials often involved the verification of measure. Ale had to be sold in standardized wooden or leather vessels marked with the Lord's seal. This was a study in metrological accountability. A common deception involved using a bowl with a false bottom or one that was slightly smaller than the legal quart. This was a process of operational auditing. The altaster would carry a master measure to compare against the brewer's stock. If a discrepancy was found, the fraudulent vessel was brought to the court as physical evidence. This reinforced the behavioral standards of the manor, proving that the integrity of the pint was as important as the integrity of the pound. It turned the act of pouring a drink into a standardized legal obligation. One must also look at the function of the quality test, beyond the price and measure. The ale had to be wholesome for the human body. This was an act of sanitary coordination. The ale taster looked for unhopped ale that had turned sour or was contaminated with poor yeast. Legend suggests a study in physical adhesion. The taster would spill a small amount on a wooden bench and sit in it wearing leather breeches. If he stuck to the bench, the ale contained too much unfermented sugar and was unfit. Whether true or not, the court's goal was material purity. A brewer of naughty ale faced the public shame of the cucking stool or a heavy fine. This was a form of public hygiene, ensuring that the village energy was sustained by a clean and honest product. The transition from production to the social sphere involved the management of the alehouse. While anyone could brew for their own family, selling ale required the view of the court. This was a study in social regulation. The court prohibited the selling of ale during the hours of divine service and regulated the presence of nightwalkers or scolds in the drinking rooms. This was a method of behavioral surveillance. The jury would report any house that became a site of brawls or illegal gaming. This reinforced the communal peace, proving that the alehouse was a managed resource rather than a site of chaos. It transformed the act of hospitality into a standardized legal presence, ensuring the village remained quiet after the curfew bell. The quirky, yet profound, element of ale law was the ale silver. This was a small fee paid by brewers to the lord for the privilege of selling. This was a study in licensing revenue. The court managed the collection of these silver payments, which funded the work of the altester and the clerk. This was an act of administrative sustainability. By turning the thirst of the village into a regulated income stream, the court maintained the structural stability of the manor's budget. It proved that even the most common human desire could be harnessed for the common good, turning the details of a brewing batch into a masterpiece of social and economic order. It was a rhythmic, predictable part of the law, a weekly pulse that kept the community's spirits and its finances in balance. You find yourself standing in the cool shade of an alehouse porch as the sun begins to set. The air is still and carries the scent of fermented grain and the sweet, heavy smell of wood fire. You see the altester marking a cask with a piece of chalk, his face a mask of steady, disciplined duty. You hear the rhythmic glug-glug of the ale being poured and the distant, muffled sound of the village bell signaling the end of the working day. The atmosphere of the porch is one of heavy, organized satisfaction. You feel a sense of profound security, realizing that the work of the Assize is ensuring the village is well. You realize that justice is the accurate brewing of life, a series of essential steps that keep the barrels full and the people healthy. So, as we settle into the imaginary scent of the fresh malt and the steady rhythm of the taster's round, remember that the story of the medieval Assize is a study in the architecture of health. It was a place where a court was a law and a bush was a sign. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of regulation, turning the details of a brewing fee into a masterpiece of social and economic order that would sustain the community through the celebrations and the trials of the year. The transition from the social atmosphere of the alehouse to the quiet shadows of the evening was governed by the watch and ward. In the medieval manor, the onset of darkness was not merely a change in light. It was a study in heightened vulnerability. To ensure the safety of the village, the court enforced a rigorous system of nocturnal surveillance. The ward referred to the daytime guard at the gates or boundaries, while the watch was the essential nighttime patrol. This was an exercise in communal vigilance. The court acted as the primary regulator of this duty, ensuring that every able-bodied man took his turn to patrol the lanes and guard the hayricks. The proceedings were marked by a steady, rhythmic auditing of the duty roster, turning the silence of the night into a masterpiece of organized protection and social responsibility. The character of the constable who organized the watch was one of sustained alertness. He was the official responsible for ensuring that the men appointed for the night were present, sober, and armed with the necessary tools of their office, usually a sturdy staff or a billhook. In his personal life, he was a figure of disciplined reliability, understanding that the security of the sleeping village rested on his ability to maintain the standardized rotation of service. He remained a man of profound civic integrity, often living a single, focused life dedicated to the protection of the parish. He was not a man of aggression. His character was defined by a quiet firmness, walking the rounds to check that his sentries had not fallen asleep. His wealth was his official status, and his role in the court was to serve as a human shield, turning the darkness into a permanent legal record of safety. One must consider the regulation of the curfew. The word itself, from the French couvre-feu cover fire, was a study in preventative safety. At the sound of the church bell, all hearth fires were to be dampened, and all residents were to remain indoors. This was a method of fire mitigation and order. The court viewed anyone wandering the lanes after the bell as a night walker, a term of heavy legal suspicion. If a tenant was caught outside without a lawful cause, such as a medical emergency or a failing animal, they were presented in court and fined. The court utilized these trials to maintain the social stability of the manor, ensuring that the cover of darkness was not used for theft or mischief. The core of these trials often involved the offense of sleeping on watch. This was viewed as a significant breach of the communal trust. This was a study in operational diligence. If the constable found a watchman slumbering at his post, the man was brought before the steward. This was a process of duty auditing. The court viewed a sleeping sentry as a mechanical failure in the village's defenses, leaving the livestock and the granaries exposed to outsiders or predators. The penalty was often a heavy fine or a period of public shame. This reinforced the behavioral standards of the manor, proving that the safety of the whole relied on the competent vigilance of the individual. It turned the act of staying awake into a standardized legal obligation. One must also look at the function of the gate closure. In many manors, the physical entrances to the village or the lord's courtyard were locked at sunset. This was an act of territorial containment. The court managed the responsibility for these keys, ensuring they were held by a trusted man of the jury. This was a study in access control. If a gate was left unbolted, allowing a stranger to enter or a valuable horse to escape, the individual responsible was held strictly accountable. This reinforced the spatial authority of the law, proving that the village was a closed machine during the hours of the night. It turned a simple bolt and hinge into a legal barrier, ensuring the peace was maintained through the physical restriction of movement. The transition from protection to the identification of threats involved the capture of the stranger. The watch was legally required to challenge anyone they did not recognize. This was a study in social identity verification. If a stranger could not give a good account of their business, they were to be detained until morning and brought before the court. This was a method of vagrancy regulation. The court viewed the unknown traveler as a potential threat to the equilibrium of the manor. By holding these individuals for questioning, the court maintained a standardized filter for the population, ensuring that only those with a legitimate purpose were allowed within the boundaries. The quirky, yet profound, element of watch law was the hue and cry at night. If a crime was discovered in the darkness, the watch was to raise the cry immediately. This was a study in auditory mobilization. Every man who heard the cry was legally bound to rise from his bed and join the pursuit. This was an act of collective response. The court was particularly harsh on those who heard the cry and remained in their blankets. This was a form of civic audition, proving that the defense of the village was a 24-hour commitment. It transformed the silence of the night into a potential alarm, turning the details of a nocturnal chase into a masterpiece of social cohesion and shared defense. You find yourself standing at the edge of the village square as the final echoes of the curfew bell fade away. The air is still and carries the scent of cooling hearths and the smell of damp thatch. You see the constable handing a lantern to the night watchman, his face a mask of steady, disciplined duty. You hear the rhythmic clink of the gate chain and the distant, muffled sound of a dog barking at a shadow in the fields. The atmosphere of the evening is one of heavy, protective silence. You feel a sense of profound security, realizing that the work of the watch and ward is keeping the village's mechanical peace intact. You realize that justice is the accurate guarding of the dark, a series of essential steps that keep the houses safe and the community whole. So, as we settle into the imaginary scent of the wood ash and the steady rhythm of the sentry's footfall, remember that the story of the medieval watch is a study in the architecture of vigilance. It was a place where a lantern was a law and a bell was a boundary. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of security, turning the details of a nighttime patrol into a masterpiece of social integrity that would protect the manor until the first light of the morning. The transition from the silent protection of the watch to the rhythmic industry of the day was heralded by the ringing of the hammer against the anvil. In the medieval manor, the smithy was not merely a workshop, it was a study in pyrotechnic necessity. The blacksmith was the primary engineer of the village, responsible for the creation and repair of the essential tools that kept the manor functioning: the plowshares, the scythes, the axes, and the iron tires for the cartwheels. This was an exercise in material maintenance. The court acted as the regulator of this vital service, ensuring that the smith adhered to standardized prices and provided honest workmanship. The proceedings were marked by a steady, rhythmic inquiry into the supply of iron and coal, turning the intense heat of the forge into a masterpiece of economic and social coordination. The character of the smith was one of exceptional physical discipline, because his trade required immense strength and a high level of specialized knowledge. He held a unique position of respect and slight wariness within the community. In his personal life, he was a figure of constant industry, his existence defined by the mechanical pulse of the bellows and the fire. He remained a man of profound technical integrity, often living a single, focused life within the smoke-darkened walls of the forge. He was not a man of outbursts. Rather, his character was defined by a quiet patience, for he understood that metal cannot be rushed. His wealth was his essential skill, and his role in the court was to serve as a human catalyst, turning raw ore into the refined instruments of the village's survival. One must consider the regulation of the iron supply. In many manors, the lord provided the Osmond raw iron, and the charcoal, and the smith was required to account for every pound used. This was a study in resource accountability. Disputes frequently arose over whether the smith was secretly selling the lord's iron for private profit. This was a method of inventory verification. The court required the smith to present the waster, the scrap, and dross as proof of the work performed. If the weight did not match the records, the smith was presented in court. This reinforced the behavioral standards of the manor, proving that the transformation of the lord's property was a strictly managed legal event. The core of these trials often involved the offense of poor workmanship, because a broken plowshare during the peak of the sowing season could lead to a village-wide disaster. The quality of the smith's work was a matter of public safety. This was a study in functional reliability. If an iron axle pin failed due to cold shut, a flaw in the welding, the tenant could bring the matter to the court. This was a process of operational auditing. The jury, often including other craftsmen, would examine the physical evidence of the break. If the smith was found negligent, he was ordered to remake the work and pay a fine. This ensured that the technological infrastructure of the village remained a reliable machine, maintained through the consistent application of customary law. One must also look at the function of farriery. The smith was also the village vet, responsible for the shoeing of horses and the gelding of livestock. This was an act of biological maintenance. The court regulated the specific fees for shoeing the lord's war horses versus the tenant's workhorses. This was a study in service pricing. If a smith overcharged a poor widow for shoeing her lone pony, he was viewed as violating the common profit of the manor. This reinforced the economic equity of the village, proving that the forge was a communal resource meant for the sustained mobility of everyone. It turned the act of driving a nail into a hoof into a standardized legal obligation, monitored by the watchful eyes of the jury. The transition from individual repairs to estate management involved the maintenance of the manorial equipment. The smith was often bound by his tenure to provide customary work, such as sharpening the lord's plows for free, or repairing the hinges on the manor gates. This was a study in tenurial obligation. The court managed the schedule of these tasks, ensuring they were completed before the season changed. This was an act of strategic coordination. If the smith prioritized a neighbor's silver inlay project over the lord's essential plow irons, he was presented for a default of service. This system ensured that the capital assets of the estate were kept in prime condition through the rhythmic application of the smith's labor. The quirky yet profound element of smithy law was the forge fine, or smith's silver. This was a small payment made by the village to support the upkeep of the bellows and the purchase of coal. This was a study in communal investment. The court managed the collection of these funds, which were held in a common chest. This was an act of institutional sustainability. By turning the fire of the forge into a shared financial responsibility, the court maintained the structural stability of the village's industry. It proved that the heat of the forge was the living heart of the manor, turning the details of a hammerstroke into a masterpiece of social and mechanical order. It was a rhythmic, predictable part of the law, a manual pulse that kept the iron hot and the community's tools sharp. You find yourself standing at the open door of the smithy as the sun reaches its height. The air is still and carries the scent of sulphurous coal and the hot, metallic smell of cooling iron. You see the smith plunging a finished plowshare into a wooden tub of water, his face a mask of steady, disciplined focus. You hear the rhythmic PSS's of the steam and the distant, muffled sound of a cart rattling over the cobbles toward the forge. The atmosphere of the workshop is one of heavy, industrial permanence. You feel a sense of profound security, realizing that the work of the smithy court is ensuring the village has the iron to break the earth. You realize that justice is the accurate tempering of the world, a series of essential steps that keep the tools strong and the community moving. So, as we settle into the imaginary vibration of the anvil and the steady rhythm of the hammer, remember that the story of the medieval smith is a study in the architecture of industry. It was a place where a spark was a law and a weld was a bond. They proved that the human spirit can maintain the peace by adhering to the practical steps of maintenance, turning the details of a metalwork dispute into a masterpiece of social and mechanical stability that would carry the manor through the plowing and the harvest for generations. The transition from the hard iron of the forge to the tactile world of the textile involved the coordination of the loom and the walk mill. In the medieval manor, the production of cloth was a study in staged manufacturing, transforming raw wool into the essential garments that protected the community from the elements. This was an exercise in material refinement. The court acted as the primary regulator of this industry, ensuring that the weaver, the fuller, and the dyer adhered to the boring but vital standards of quality and measurement. The proceedings were marked by a steady, rhythmic inquiry into the length of the cloth and the weight of the yarn, turning the soft fleece of the sheep into a masterpiece of economic and social coordination. The character of the weaver was one of intense geometric focus. He was the craftsman responsible for the complex mechanical logic of the loom, interlacing the warp and the weft to create a durable fabric. In his personal life, he was a figure of disciplined patience, his existence defined by the constant, rhythmic movement of the shuttle. He remained a man of profound technical integrity, often living a single, focused life within the lint-filled air of his workshop. He was not a man of reactions. Rather, his character was defined by a quiet precision, for he understood that a single dropped thread could ruin a whole bolt of cloth. His wealth was his specialized dexterity, and his role in the court was to serve as a human loom, turning the village's raw wool into a permanent legal record of productive labor. One must consider the regulation of the web. The law required that all cloth sold in the marketplace adhere to the Assize of cloth, which set the standard width and length for specific types of fabric. This was a study in dimensional accountability. If a weaver produced a short cloth that shrank after the first rain, they were presented in court and fined. This was a method of consumer protection. The court utilized these trials to maintain the social stability of the manor, ensuring that the villagers received fair value for their wool. This system of standardized weaving was the primary gear that kept the local textile market honest and reliable. The core of these trials often involved the offense of the fulling mill. Once the cloth was woven, it had to be fulled, thickened, and cleaned by being beaten in water. This was a study in industrial transition, originally done by the walking or tucking of the cloth by human feet. Many manors replaced this with the mechanical fulling mill. The court viewed the mill as a technological monopoly, similar to the grain mill. If a weaver tried to full at home to avoid the lord's fee, they were presented for a trespass of the mill. This was a process of operational enforcement. The court would seize the unauthorized cloth and fine the offender, proving that the infrastructure of the manor was an absolute system that could not be bypassed. One must also look at the function of the dyer and the wode. To add color to the fabric, the cloth was passed to the dyer, who utilized plants like woad or madder. This was an act of chemical standardization. The court regulated the quality of the dyes to ensure they were fast and did not wash out. This was a study in material integrity. If a dyer used false colors or poor fixatives, the resulting streaky cloth was brought to the court as physical evidence of the fraud. This reinforced the behavioral standards of the manor, proving that the visual quality of the product was a matter of legal concern. It turned the act of dipping a cloth into a vat into a standardized legal obligation, monitored by the watchful eyes of the jury. The transition from the workshop to the market involved the sealing of the cloth before a bolt could be sold. It had to be inspected by the almoner, who attached a lead seal to the fabric to certify its quality. This was a study in official validation. The court managed the accounts of these seals, which provided a vital source of revenue for the manor. This was an act of institutional oversight. If a merchant was caught selling unsealed cloth, they were viewed as a cheat and subjected to the public correction of the court. This system ensured that the commercial reputation of the manor was protected through the rhythmic application of the law's seal. The quirky, yet profound, element of textile law was the tentering of the cloth. After filling, the wet cloth was stretched on large wooden frames, called tenters, to dry to the correct size. This was a study in physical tension. If a weaver stretched the cloth too far to gain extra length, known as over-tentering, the fabric would become thin and weak. This was a method of deceptive expansion. The court officials would visit the tenter grounds to measure the distance between the hooks. This reinforced the spatial authority of the law, proving that even the drying of a fabric was a managed event. It turned a simple wooden frame into a legal gauge, ensuring the village cloth remained strong and true. You find yourself standing in the open meadow of the tenter ground as the sun reaches its height. The air is still and carries the scent of damp wool and the sharp, earthy smell of the dye vats. You see the weaver checking the tension of a long bolt of blue cloth, his face a mask of steady, disciplined focus. You hear the rhythmic clack-clack of the distant loom and the muffled sound of the water wheel turning at the fulling mill. The atmosphere of the meadow is one of heavy, industrious completion. You feel a sense of profound stability, realizing that the work of the cloth court is ensuring the village is well clothed. You realize that justice is the accurate weaving of the community, a series of essential steps that keep the fabric strong and the people protected. As the final seal is pressed into the lead and the weaver rolls the finished bolt, the court session for the day draws to a quiet close. The shadows of the great hall stretch long across the stone floor, and the heavy parchment of the court roll is finally rolled and tied. The voices of the jurors and the clatter of the mill fade into the gathering dusk. You realize that the intricate web of laws, from the iron of the forge to the threads of the loom, has successfully maintained the delicate balance of the manor. The people return to their cottages, the land remains fertile, and the mechanical heart of the village continues to beat with the steady, predictable pulse of the law. The story of the court is finished, and the peace of the manor is once again secure.